as I mentioned before, we have been looking in the book of Kings, 2 Kings, and also at the same time, 2 Chronicles. And so in our last study, and this is what we're going to continue into this week, is looking at Elisha and the work that God was doing through him. We're going to continue that and get into then Joram and Jehoram and look at their reigns. And if we have time, I want to get into Hazael and some others as well. So we've been doing this kind of between Israel and Judah, going back and forth. We spent a lot of time in Israel, but we'll get back to Judah in just a little while. But as we continue, as I mentioned, we're in 2 Kings chapter 6. And that's what we looked at last week. We've been going through these deeds of Elisha and some of the things God was doing through him, some of the powerful workings of the Holy Spirit. We saw how he healed the waters of Jericho, which, there's a lot of interesting things about that backstory behind it, but how he cursed the irreverent boys, prophesied at the feet of Moab, blessed the widow's oil. We also looked at the Shunammite woman, and then how he blessed her and then raised her son later on. He purified the deadly stew. And then last week we spent a lot of time in chapter 5 looking at the healing of Naaman, who had this terminal illness of leprosy. There was no natural way to heal it. Even today, from my understanding, there's no way to heal leprosy. It's still a permanent disorder, disease, but yet God did that. And then we ended by quickly looking at how he caused the axe head to float. And that's where I want to pick up tonight. Let's go to chapter 6 and go to verse 8. And I want to begin there looking at Elisha's army. Let me turn there with you. So, a little bit of a backstory here. You've got Elisha is interesting because he does a lot of his work in Israel, not Judah. He's at least more prominent in that area. But he also is prominent in his work prophesying in regard to Syria. And of course, Syria is becoming a national or world power at the time. So keep that in mind as we move forward. It's going to eventually become the power and later be known as not Syria but Assyria. And so as we move forward, we'll keep that in mind. So let's go to verse 8 and notice what's going on there. Once when the king of Syria, so you notice right away what? There's no definite time frame, I get my words out, for when this took place. Now, I'm going to assume, rightly or wrongly, that this is probably during the time of time of Joram, and while he's reigning in Israel, but it's hard to be exact because the writer is not exact. So he says, once when the king of Syria was warring against Israel, he took counsel with his servants, saying, at such and such a place shall be my camp. But the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are going down there. And the king of Israel, again, I think it's probably Jehoram. Can't be for certain, but likely him. And so the man of God, of course, who would that be? That's Elisha. We find out later in the text. And so the king of Syria, the king preceding Ben-Hadad, is trying to, it sounds like, assassinate, or at least to make war against the Israelites. He's either trying to assassinate the king or try to make war. But Elisha gets word of this from God that this is going to happen. And so he sends warning. And so this keeps going on. And verse 11 tells us that the mind of the king of Syria was greatly troubled because of this thing. And so he calls his servants and he said to them, will you not show me who of us is for the king of Israel? And so he obviously thinks, what? It must be somebody inside my inner circle is a rat, right? He's a traitor and he's a spy for the king of Israel, which you wouldn't necessarily think. But it's interesting in verse 12, the response, they say, none, my lord, O king, the words that you speak in your... Oh, sorry. I skipped a line. It'd be good for me to address the context. None, my lord, O king, but Elisha the prophet who is in Israel tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. And so I don't know how they know this. I think that's interesting. I don't know, do they have spies in Israel who know what Elisha's doing? I don't know that we can know that. But somehow the men around the king know Elisha's doing this. And I'm sure they're trying to save their own bacon here because, he's going to kill somebody. And so the king of Syria decides, well, I need to kill Elisha, so we need to capture him. And so he's in Dothan. And so they sent, verse 14, horses and chariots and a great army, and they came by night and surrounded the city. And so they've come to where he is, and so they surround the city to basically capture him. And so you can imagine being in the men surrounding Elisha. What would their reaction possibly be? Well, we're in big trouble now. So one of them goes out. We're not told a name, but one of the servants of Elisha goes out. He sees what's going on, and he's really troubled about it. And so he says, end of verse 15, what shall we do? Now Elisha's not troubled. He doesn't seem perplexed by this. He doesn't seem fearful at all. He doesn't even seem very shocked by it. But what does he do? Well, verse 17 says he prayed and said, O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see. So there's something Elisha can see that this servant, this young prophet possibly, cannot see. And what was it? Well, the text goes on to say, so the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Now, what's the symbolic meaning of that? Yeah, why couldn't the servant see this army? What was it?
Possibly angels.
Yeah, so they have some kind of spiritual form, seemingly. They're not in physical form. It's likely, I think, probably angels, but whatever you want to call them. God has put this envelope of protection around Elisha. And so Elisha says, the ones with me are much greater than them, so I'm not going to worry about it. And so, it seems like Elisha could always see them there, but not everybody could, but he could.
Interesting too, Elijah had left in the chariot of fire, and when Moses was led by the fire, cloud of fire.
Yeah, nice.
Something to do with
God interacting a lot of times in a similar way. And so, God opens up his eyes and then closes the eyes of the Syrian army. Verses 18 and following, Elisha asked that God would close their eyes, that they would not be able to see. And then he, and I'm going to just paraphrase just for time's sake, but he then basically leads them to Samaria, which that's significant. Why?
It's the capital of Syria, capital of Israel.
It's the capital of Israel. That's where the Israelite army would be. So this army of some size is led right into the heart. I wonder what's meant by the term blind there. How did he lead them if they all were completely blind? I don't know how that was possible, but maybe they were. Maybe they were completely blind, couldn't see anything. Maybe they were partially blinded, I don't know. But in some way they couldn't see clearly, obviously. And so he leads them into the city, and then God opens their eyes back up, and they see where they are. Now, I also think it's interesting that the reaction may be a little different than you might expect. You might expect, I don't know, that God would then send out the Israelite army and just destroy them off the face of the earth. Is that what happens?
You give them food and stuff and send them on their way.
Yeah, they end up feeding them and then sending them back. The king comes to Elisha before all that, and he says, "Now, what do you want us to do?" Basically. Now, he uses an interesting term that I just want to mention real quickly. Verse 21, as soon as the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elisha, "My father, shall I strike them down? Shall I strike them down?" So I'm going to come back to this in just a minute. But just seeing what's going on, he is looking to the authority of Elisha. I mean, Elisha did bring him into the city. And he recognizes this man's acting under the power of God. And so he says, should we kill him? What's Elisha's response?
No, don't kill him, feed him.
Yeah, don't kill him. Would you take would you as an army take captives only then to go and kill them? Basically is what he says. And so no, he says, feed them and then release them. We know that after that happens, verse 23, he prepared for them a great feast, and when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their master, and then notice, and the Syrians did not come again on raids into the land of Israel. So this gave Israel, this event, gave Israel a break, at least peace with the Syrians for a certain amount of time. Now, this isn't, when he says they didn't come back in, he doesn't mean permanently, obviously. But for a period of time, till this king died, whoever that was in Syria, he no longer raided into the land of Israel. Now, it is fascinating, the term there, and back in verse 21, he says, "My father, shall I strike them down?" Now, why does he use that term, "my father"? Now, some may go there and say, use this as support for some religious groups calling their minister or priest father. Is that what's going on here? We know they're likely not related. It's not the son of Elisha who's king. Seems to be a term of endearment, not a religious title, as it's used in our modern connotation. In some churches, they will use it as a title for a particular church member, but that's not the way The king is using it. How's he using it? Well, term of endearment. Also, it seems to be a way that he's acquiescing to the authority of Elisha in this moment. It also may be the fact that Elisha's older than he is. But it's not a title that was bestowed upon Elisha as a prophet. And so you have Elisha here defeating the Syrians without ever having to symbolically fire a shot. He basically blinded them, and he walked them right into the capital city and gave them over to the king. All right, y'all going to start talking, right? Maybe I need to ask better questions. Sometimes it's not good. I need to ask better questions. All right, let's go on. Now, we get into some pretty dark times. So it's been some time since that event. The verse 24 tells us that now Ben-Hadad is king of Syria. Now, what do we know about Ben-Hadad? How does the Bible seem to depict him? Is he a nice, pleasant king?
Pretty harsh.
Pretty harsh. He was a very brutal man. He did not like Israel. He seems to hate Israel. And so he decides eventually to attack Israel. So Israel has had some peace for a period of time, but now that time has ended. Ben-Hadad is now king. And so verse 24 says he gathered together, mustered his entire army. It'd be interesting to know how many soldiers that would be. I have no idea, no way of knowing. But it would have been large. Syria is a huge country. And so they traveled down to Samaria and surround the city. Now, what's Samaria's, what's the king's reaction? Well, he basically locks them up inside. So this is a pretty kind of dire situation. Israel's army is not comparable to Syria's in as far as numbers and military power. And we also know that they are not really in a good relationship with God, so they don't even have that really on their side here. But God is going to give them a little bit of grace and mercy, as we'll see. So they've got that against them. They're besieged on every side. They're locked up inside the city walls. They have another problem. What was the other problem? Did you catch it? There's a famine, and it is severe. Now we find out later that this famine is going to last for 7 years. I think as Americans, we have a really hard time relating to the idea or concept of famine. I've never in my life experienced a famine. I doubt anybody in this room has ever. I guess the last real kind of famine we had was, in the 1930s, after the Depression. Things got really bad. We've had difficult times, but not a famine, not like this. And how bad things have gotten, the writer gives us a little bit of a description of how bad. Notice a couple of the things he says. Number one, he denotes the price of goods. Now we are in the middle in this country, in the middle of a period of inflation. Inflation is what? It's when too many dollars chasing too few goods, and it causes the prices to raise up. If you've been buying gifts for Christmas, you understand, things are a little more expensive this year. You also will know that if you go in and get a carton of eggs. If you haven't done that lately, you may get sticker shock from it. I bought a turkey the other day and got a little sticker shock. Prices have gone up, haven't they? Well, consider the price here and what's being priced in the text. Let's read this. Let's see, verse 25, there was a great famine in Samaria, and they besieged it. A lot on the side of Syria here. They have a lot of things that if you were an army, you might think were good for you, right? If you're Syria, not if you're Israel. But notice, there's this famine going on, and inflation had gotten so bad that a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver. And a fourth part, this is disgusting, but this is what it says, right? A fourth part of a cab of doves dung for 5 shekels of silver. I'm not a fan of eating the head of anything. I remember I was doing some mission work sometimes and in one place, and a delicacy in this country are fish eyes. And I know this is my American heritage speaking, but I wanted no part of that. You can have them. I don't want them. A donkey's head? We had a member a few years ago like to have brains. He liked to eat big brains, right? And eggs. Not my cup of tea, right? I don't want anything in that part of the body. 80 shekels. It's hard to denote kind of the value of that, but 80 shekels is a lot of money. And then dove's dung. I don't even want to know any more about that. That's enough for me. I know.
So what kind of dish do you make with that?
I don't want to know. And it's just a fourth of that. We also find out later that most of the horses have been eaten. They only had, I think, 5 remaining. And then we get to the truly sad part. Verse 26. Now, as the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, he's walking around the city wall, a woman cried out to him, saying, "Help, my lord, O king." And he said, "If the Lord will not help you, how shall I help you?" I mean, the times are pretty depressing at this point. From the threshing floor or from the winepress? And the king asked her, "What is your trouble?" She answered, "This woman said to me, give your son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow." Just sit there for a minute. Just let that sink in. Disgusting, right? Disturbing. And then go on. It gets worse. "So we boiled my son and ate him." And the next day I said to her, "Give your son that we may eat him." And she has hidden her son. When the king heard the words of the woman, he tore his clothes. Now he was passing by on the wall. And the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth beneath his body. And he said, "May God do so to me, and more also, if the head of Elisha, the son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today." There's just not a whole lot I want to talk about with this, but it's there. You know, sometimes we think things are bad here. Just take a minute and appreciate our blessings. There's so much wrong with this, isn't there? But it does at least give us insight into the situation. It is bad. And so you might then realize why the king of Syria thinks he's going to win. And why the king of Israel is tearing his clothes and wearing sackcloth. Now, I don't know why he's blaming Elisha for this. Sometimes we just need somebody to blame. But he believes Elisha's at fault in some way. And so he is ready to behead him. Now, verse 32, Elisha is sitting in his house with some elders about him. And so they send a messenger to retrieve Elisha. And I'm just going to move ahead here a little bit. Let's see. The messenger says to Elisha, "This trouble is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" So ultimately, who are they really blaming? God. Now, is it God's fault? Does any of this have anything to do with God?
No.
We want to blame God for a lot, don't we? Because at least it gives us power to blame somebody where we feel empowered somehow. And so if we move over to chapter 7, the text goes on. Elisha said, "Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow." Now think about how bad things are right now. Get that picture in your mind. And then hear what Elisha say. "Tomorrow, about this time, a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel." Now, how much was the donkey's head valued at? 80 shekels. Now you're talking about a seah of flour for a shekel. Big change. And 2 seah for barley, 2 seah of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. So he gives this prophetic message that things are going to drastically change. Now, why do things change at this moment? I don't really know. I know God has decided to end the famine, or he's going to bring a blessing on them. And we know it's from God because of what happens later. But that's a drastic change. Now, if you were hearing that, you might be tempted to think, "Elisha, you're a moron." Like, where do you get that from? How is God going to change things so dramatically? You know, you can have all the money in the world, but if you don't have anything to buy, that money is not very valuable to you, is it? And so, how is God going to do this? Well, we find out. Well, before we do that, I just want to read the response of one man. We're not even given his name, but he's the captain. He's one of the captains of the king. And he said, when he heard this, "If the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could this thing be?" His response is what? It ain't happening. You're just blowing smoke, Elisha. And maybe he thinks Elisha's just saying this to save his head. I don't know. But he doesn't believe it. And what's Elisha's response? You're going to see it. It's going to happen. But you won't get to enjoy it. It's not happening for you, but you'll see it so that you can see that what I'm saying is the truth. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. So what happens? I'm going to just kind of summarize the next few verses here, but there are 4 men who are lepers. Now, what do we know about lepers?
They're ostracized.
They're ostracized. These 4 are outside the city. If you're a leper, if you're an Israelite leper, you're kind of out in limbo all by yourself because you can't come into Samaria. At the same time, you're an Israelite, so you can't go to Syria. You really have nowhere to turn. But these 4 men are also terminally ill. They're going to die. And so they're basically like at the end of their rope. I'm sure they're starving to death. And they say, well, if we go into the city, we'll just die with everybody else. Or we can go to Syria And if they feed us, that's awesome, right? Maybe we get fed there. But you know what? If they kill us, we're going to die anyway. So they decide, well, we'll just go over to the Syrian camp and we'll see if we can get something to eat. Desperate times. When they get to the camp, what do they find? Nobody. Now, I want you to imagine this. Now, remember, how many soldiers did he bring? The king of Syria. All of them. He mustered his whole army. That's a huge camp. I can only imagine there are just tents, beyond tents, beyond tents. This area must have been covered in military array. So they get out there and it's a ghost city. It almost is kind of one of those moments where you probably felt very eerie just standing there, because not only are all the tents still there, but what else do we see? Or did they see?
Supplies and all the stuff's still there.
Yeah, all their supplies, they left everything and just hightailed it out of there. So these 4 men are like, I'm sure they're like, we hit the jackpot, baby. Right? They go in the tent, they eat together. I'm sure they had a fun time. They grab stuff, they go out and they hide it, they come back, and what happens? Their conscience gets them, doesn't it? They're like, this is not right. This is not good what we're doing. This is a good thing. We need to go tell people. Eventually word gets back to the king and they find out. They sent some men out there to check it out. Because the king's like, and this is, from a human perspective, is probably pretty smart. What's his thought when he first hears it?
They're trying to trick.
It's a trick,
They're
right?
just setting us up.
They're setting us up. They're going to wait till we come in and they're just going to invade us. And then they're going to get into the city. Because of yet they besieged the city, but they ain't gotten in. And so he sends some men out there. They find out, hey, it's not. Now, why is the Syrian army gone?
They thought it was an interaction with God of some sort.
They heard the sound of chariots coming or something.
Yeah, so God somehow had sent the sound of chariots coming, or what sounded like a huge army coming on the Syrians. Now, how God did that? Did he do it providentially? Did he do it miraculously? We're actually not told, but it was convincing enough. Can you imagine that? It was convincing enough. They left everything and ran away. The amount of military equipment they left behind, the value of that must have been astronomical, along with all their other goods. There's a lot of money, there's a lot of value materially on that field. And so God then provides this bounty for the Israelites. Even this period of sin and time of cultural demise in Israel, God still is blessing them. Even during that, He gives them a blessing. Without God's help, where would they be? Those last 5 horses were about to see their end, weren't they? Eventually, you would have had a ghost city inside Samaria. We do, interestingly enough, find out that just as Elisha had said, verse 16, then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Syrians. So a fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, just as Elisha had promised, according to the word of the Lord. Now the king had appointed the captain. Remember that guy? What did Elisha say?
You'll see it, but you won't be able to eat it.
You'll see it, but you won't enjoy it. had appointed the captain on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. And the people trampled him in the gate, so that he died, as the man of God, Elisha, had said when the king came down to him. And so, just as prophesied, you have this interesting narrative here of how God blessed Israel, even in the midst of this famine. And so, again, the prophetic, or the providential work of God at hand. Any questions, comments about that? Now, just real briefly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we later on, so the famine ends, verse 1 in chapter 8, we find out that this famine has been going on for 7 years. We also find out at the beginning of chapter 8 that Elisha had warned the Shunammite woman that she needed to leave town. And so maybe the reason that the king is so upset at Elisha was because Elisha had prophesied that this famine was coming. I don't know. Text never really says that clearly, but I'm going to assume that may be the case. But he said, you need to leave. So she goes to the land of the Philistines, and there she dwells for 7 years. Well, 7 years is a long time. And so she comes back, and she needs to appeal to the king that her land be given back to her family. And he does that. I do one other interesting note here in chapter 8. Who is talking to the king in verse 4?
Elisha's servant, Gehazi.
The who?
I said Elisha's servant,
Gehazi, the servant of Elisha. Now, what do we know about Gehazi?
He'd gone back.
Leprosy.
He was a leper now. You remember, he's the one that, after Elisha said he didn't want anything from Naaman, he's the one that chased down Naaman and lied to him to get some things from him. And he's the one that God cursed by giving the leprosy of Naaman and putting it on him and his descendants. I think it's interesting. He's now in the presence of the king, and what's he doing? He's sitting there talking about all the good things Elisha has done. So at least it seems to indicate he hasn't been... I just think it's interesting. He's sitting there talking good about Elisha after what happened to him. And there he is with the king. It's also interesting he's a leper and he's in the presence of the king. That's also not common. Wouldn't have been common. But this woman comes back, and eventually we find out in the verse 6 that her lands are restored to her. And then next week we'll finish this stuff up with Elisha, and we'll talk about Hazael and Ben-Hadad and what happened with them. Hazael will eventually become king, and he'll be even more brutal than Ben-Hadad on the people of Israel. We'll continue that. Then we'll go into to Joram and the other kings. Any questions or comments? All right. We'll go ahead and stop here and be rejoined for our devotional time in just a couple of minutes. Thank you all.
Gehazi had been